On a winter night in 39 AD, Rome froze. Not because of the cold, but because every family knew this was the night someone's daughter would disappear. Imagine being 14 years old, already in your nightclothes, thinking the world outside your window is calm, when suddenly you hear armored footsteps echoing down your street. You grew up hearing that a call from the emperor was a privilege. No one warned you it could come without warning. No one warned you the guards would cross your threshold as if your home already belonged to them. And absolutely no one warned you why they carried a lantern covered in red cloth, a lantern they would place in front of your door. In a few minutes, you'll hear your mother whisper your name as if saying it too loudly might anger the gods. In a few minutes, your father will force a smile he cannot hold. And in a few minutes, you'll learn the truth every noble family fears. The Palatine doesn't summon daughters, it claims them. And if you think Flavia's nightmare begins here, you're wrong. What's waiting for her inside the palace makes this moment feel merciful. This isn't rumor. This was the night the Garden of Venus opened. A ritual so terrifying that Rome buried every trace of it. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Grim History, hit the like button, and once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. And the girl who will learn the truth first is Flavia. Remember Flavia, because everything you're about to learn forged the man who will soon decide her fate. To understand how a human being can rot from the inside and emerge as a creature capable of consuming an entire empire, you must go back to the beginning, back to the bloodline that birthed him and the shadows that shaped him long before Rome learned to fear his name. Caligula did not materialize out of madness. He was born into glory, the son of Germanicus, Rome's golden general, the man whose very presence could quiet a legion and ignite a city. The boy should have inherited honor, strength, nobility. Instead, something far more corrosive seeped into him. His childhood did not unfold in gardens or tutors' halls. It unfolded on the raw edge of the empire, in military camps drenched in sweat, iron, and the metallic breath of war. He learned to walk between rows of hardened legionaries, the ground vibrating with the thud of hobnailed sandals. The soldiers adored the sight of their commander's son in miniature armor and called him Caligula, Little Boot. A nickname meant in love, but one that would soon cling to a far darker legacy. But even then, something inside him bent. That frontier world taught him its first rule: power isn't inherited, it's taken. And once you take it, you don't ask forgiveness for how you use it. It was the first crack in the child's soul, and the cracks were about to deepen. The shattering blow came with the mysterious death of Germanicus. Overnight, the beloved child became a target. He watched, helpless, as his mother and brothers were exiled, imprisoned, and executed one by one. No enemy army, no barbarian tribe, just the cold will of Emperor Tiberius. And then came Capri, the island where Rome imagined Tiberius retired in peace, but where something monstrous festered behind palace doors. And the twisted lessons Caligula learned here, Flavia will pay for them in ways she cannot yet imagine. Caligula, barely more than a boy, was forced to live beside the man who had annihilated his family. Capri was not a refuge. It was a gilded coffin, sealed with paranoia. For 6 suffocating years, he survived under the gaze of an emperor who trusted no one and killed on a whim. There, Caligula learned a new rule. One far darker than the first. To live, you must smile at the man you want to destroy. He hid every tear, swallowed every tremor of rage, and bowed to the murderer of his blood. And while he remained outwardly obedient, the fractures in his mind widening until something cold and resentful slipped through. So when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD and the Senate lifted Caligula, now 24, into the throne, Rome erupted in a frenzy of relief. A new dawn. A new prince. The son of Germanicus had come to cleanse the rot. And for a moment, he did. He freed prisoners, destroyed the records of Tiberius's spies, cut hated taxes, poured gold into the streets, games, and feasts. Rome believed it had been saved. But the man who will one day reach for Flavia has not fully awakened yet. His darkness is only stretching its wings. But salvation was only the mask. Because near the end of that first year, an illness struck so violently that the emperor hovered between life and death. And when he rose from that bed, Something vital had not returned with him. The boy who learned to hide his hatred on Capri no longer needed to hide anything at all. Standing atop the Palatine Hill, staring down at a city that worshipped him, Caligula finally grasped a terrible truth. At the peak of absolute power, there are no gods left above you, only victims below. The cheers of the masses, the trembling silence of the Senate, these did not humble him. His sanity sloughed away like dead skin, and beneath it emerged the creature Capri had carved. Generosity twisted into mania, justice curdled into cruelty. And within the darkness of his thoughts, an idea began to harden. Women of noble blood were not citizens, not daughters, not humans. They were instruments. And the first instrument he will test is waiting on a night Flavia does not yet know will destroy her life. This shift didn't fall on Rome like a thunderstorm. It crept into the city like a sickness. Slow, quiet, untraceable. A poison that seeped beneath marble floors and into patrician homes until it reached the people who believed themselves safest. And somewhere across Rome, Flavia's household heard the same knock. The knock no family dared answer, but no one was allowed to refuse. It began with a visit. The emperor's heralds did not carry swords that day. They carried scrolls sealed with imperial purple, a color that meant life or extinction. Inside those scrolls was the demand no parent dared refuse. Send your daughter, not just any daughter, the most beautiful, the most pure, the most politically advantageous. Families called it an honor. They knew it was a death sentence wearing perfume. To deny the emperor was treason. To obey him was to hand your child to the beast. The girls were taken to a secluded wing of the palace, a place Caligula named with cruel irony the Garden of Venus. Flavia stepped across this threshold, believing she still had control. She would lose that illusion before sunrise. At first glance, it was paradise. Pink marble walls, silk-lined beds, exotic perfumes, and servants who moved like shadows anticipating every need. The daughters of Rome stepped inside believing they had been chosen for sacred service. But slowly, agonizingly, they realized the truth. Paradise was only the decoration. The prison was everything beneath it. And the real purpose of this place, the horror it concealed, was still waiting to reveal itself. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. Because once Flavia's summons came, she would learn the garden did not break girls quickly. It broke them slowly enough for them to understand every step of their undoing. The jewels they were forced to wear weren't decorations, they were chains, heavy gold, cold against their skin, branding each girl as state-owned property. The transparent silks were worse. Garments designed not to clothe them, but to expose them, to remind them that their bodies no longer belonged to themselves. Their names were the first thing Caligula erased. Real names were dangerous. Real names meant identity. So he replaced them with numbers, mockeries, and humiliating nicknames whispered by the emperor himself. With every stripped identity, the Garden of Venus tightened its grip. But the true weapon of the system wasn't jewelry, silk, or even fear. It was waiting. A torture that spilled no blood and left no visible scars, yet hollowed them from the inside out. They never knew when the summons would come. It could be tonight, it could be weeks from now. And every moment in between was an execution by anticipation. The echo of Praetorian sandals in the hallway made their hearts rupture with terror. Breathing became a chore. Sleep became impossible. By the time Caligula ever touched them, the psychological damage was already complete. They were prey softened for the killing. And when the summons finally arrived, it led them not to a private chamber, but to the emperor's nightly theatre, the banquets. The young women were paraded before Rome's elite like exotic animals on display. Not guests, but living ornaments. Caligula walked among them with the arrogance of a butcher choosing cuts of meat. He commented loudly on their bodies, mocking, praising, ranking, stripping away the last shreds of dignity they clung to. But the real cruelty wasn't his voice. It was the silence of the men who should have protected them. Fathers, uncles, fiancés, all seated at tables of honor, forced to nod at the emperor's obscenities, their smiles stretched so tight they looked carved on. Any flicker of discomfort, any tremor of disgust could condemn them. or the girl to immediate death. That silence was its own kind of execution. And then came the final act. Not chaos, not frenzy, but a ritual rehearsed like theatre. Soft music played to smother the screams. Selected spectators watched in forced admiration, and unspoken rules governed every movement the victim had to make. This wasn't pleasure for Caligula. This was choreography, a show, a demonstration that he owned not just bodies, but souls. And Flavia, standing under torchlight, realized the emperor didn't even see her as human anymore. He saw her as a classroom where he practiced cruelty. Take Flavia, daughter of a respected consul. When she crossed the threshold of the Garden of Venus for the first time, she still believed she might serve in ceremonies or walk beside the emperor. For the first days, Caligula showered her with gifts, attentiveness, even counterfeit gentleness. It disarmed her, it softened her, it set the trap. And when it finally snapped, when the illusion shattered and the truth bared its teeth, Flavia understood the one rule that governed this palace. You cannot resist a man who believes he is a god. Caligula wielded cruelty with expertise. He alternated brutality with feigned affection, beating a girl one night and weeping in her lap the next as he offered jewels worth kingdoms. This emotional whiplash rewired the mind. Victims no longer saw him clearly, hope and terror blended, comfort and violence fused. The one who broke them became the only one who could soothe them, a dependency engineered to make escape impossible. But Caligula wasn't finished. He destroyed solidarity next. Flavia tried to disappear into the crowd of victims, but in the Garden of Venus, being invisible could get you killed just as quickly as being noticed. He ranked the girls who pleased him most, who disappointed him, who would receive favor or punishment. He turned them against one another until they clawed for crumbs of safety, each girl seeing the others not as companions, but as competition for survival. Unity died. And once unity died, the emperor owned everything. And when he tired of one of them, he didn't free her, he sold her. Clandestine auctions inside the palace walls offered broken young women to senators and generals, the same men who governed Rome by day. Caligula forced them to participate, staining their hands with the same filth that coated his own. Shared guilt is the strongest leash. And now the empire's elite were chained to him by their silence. But the shame did not stop there. Families were ordered to be grateful. Some fathers were forced to host celebratory feasts after their daughters were defiled. They toasted their child's honor while swallowing their horror like poison. In the Palatine, gratitude became another word for despair. And through all this, surveillance tightened like a noose. No corner was safe. Guards, slaves, spies, eyes everywhere. Even one muffled cry in the night could be reported as rebellion. Inside the Garden of Venus, layer after layer of humanity was scraped away until nothing remained but flesh, fear, and the echo of footsteps coming closer. By 40 and 41 AD, the palace atmosphere had become toxic enough to suffocate. The girls who once arrived with bright eyes and soft voices were now skeletal phantoms drifting through the corridors. Many stopped speaking entirely. Some stopped responding. Their minds retreated inward, hiding in the last place Caligula couldn't reach. Doctors noted dissociation, souls detaching from bodies just to survive. But the truth the court tried hardest to hide was far darker. The suicides had begun. And once they began, they did not stop. Some girls broke, others shattered. Flavia. She was caught somewhere in the middle, too frightened to die, too broken to live. Whispers among the servants spoke of 6 confirmed suicides, but everyone knew the truth. 6 was only the number the palace failed to hide. The real count was buried under marble floors and imperial silence. And Flavia began to wonder if surviving was actually the cruelest outcome. Death, once the thing they feared most, became the only horizon that offered relief. A final act of sovereign freedom in a world where they owned nothing else. Not even their own names. Some slit their veins with shards of shattered vases. Some tore strips of silk from their luxurious dresses and fashioned nooses from them. Others simply climbed the balconies and stepped off, letting gravity deliver the mercy their emperor never would. For these girls, the cold arms of death were kinder than Caligula's touch. But the emperor was not satisfied. In his delusion of godhood, he devised a new cruelty, a torment so perverse it attacked the victims through the people they loved. He allowed parents to visit their daughters, not to rescue them, not to comfort them, but to watch them suffer. The girls were painted, perfumed, dressed in silks to hide their bruises. They were forced to smile, forced to act, forced to lie, their horror concealed behind cosmetics and trembling lips. And the parents, under the unblinking eyes of centurions, had to pretend this was a celebration. If a mother's voice cracked, she was executed. If a daughter dared let the mask slip, her family paid the price. Everyone was trapped in a grotesque theatre, swallowing their agony while the architect of their suffering watched with satisfaction. But then Caligula made the single mistake every tyrant eventually makes. He humiliated the men who carried the swords. Destroying women wasn't enough. He needed to emasculate the pillars of Rome itself. He dragged senators to watch their wives be violated. He mocked commanders of the Praetorian Guard, stripping them of dignity in front of their own men. He forced honored soldiers to utter vulgar passwords designed to degrade them. And among those soldiers was a man whose loyalty had once been unbreakable. Cassius Chaerea, a hardened veteran and faithful servant of Germanicus. Caligula's mockery of him was relentless. The emperor thought himself untouchable. He believed no blade would ever dare rise against him. He was wrong. The hatred in Chaerea and the conspirators mutated into something no longer political. It became survival. Caligula, once a useful tool, had become a malignant tumor eating through the Roman state. And on January 24, 41 AD, the tension finally exploded. During the Palatine Games, Caligula left through a private underground corridor, the Cryptoporticus, to take a bath. He entered the dim stone passageway believing himself immortal. He would not leave it alive. Chaerea and the conspirators blocked his path. There was no speech, no trial, no warning, only steel. The first strike, a blade to the neck, shattered his larynx, silencing the man who had demanded to be worshipped as a god. His cries choked in a flood of his own blood. Then came the frenzy. More than 30 stab wounds tore into him. The self-proclaimed Jupiter of Rome fell to the ground, writhing, pleading, dying like the terrified mortal he truly was. His life ended in a puddle of blood, humiliation etched across his contorted face. But the nightmare was not over. Just a few meters away, sealed inside the Garden of Venus, the young women heard the chaos, the screams, the metal clashing, the thunder of rushing feet. They huddled in corners, shaking, unable to understand whether this was salvation or another form of doom. Then, silence. Not the heavy silence of oppression, but the empty, unfamiliar silence of a world where the monster was suddenly gone. Yet none of them dared move, because after years in that palace, they understood one thing with horrifying clarity. When something ends in Rome, something worse often begins. And they were right to fear. Caligula's death did not birth a golden dawn. It opened a void. His Germanic bodyguards, discovering their emperor dead, erupted in blind fury. The palace transformed into a slaughterhouse within minutes. They cut down servants, officials, anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. For the young women, the Garden of Venus became a death trap. Some fled barefoot through corridors littered with broken glass and bodies. Others, paralyzed by years of conditioning, barricaded themselves in their chambers, gripping each other in the dark, waiting to see whether the next hand on the door would kill them or free them. Hours later, when the blood haze finally cleared, an unlikely figure emerged from hiding. Claudius, Caligula's trembling uncle, dragged from behind a curtain and thrust onto the imperial throne. Claudius, ever the survivor, faced an impossible truth. If Rome learned what had happened inside the Garden of Venus, the system, the complicity, the noble family's participation, the empire itself might crack. So he made a decision darker than silence and far more convenient. For the survivors of the Garden of Venus, Rome's solution was not justice. It was payment. A cold transaction meant to suffocate the truth before it could take a single breath. The palace returned the young women to their families, draped in gold, clothed in expensive fabrics, and carrying dowries large enough to silence an entire city. But every coin carried the same unspoken command: forget. Forget what happened, forget who did it. Forget the daughters. Rome fed to a god who wasn't a god at all. No trials were held. No accomplices were punished. Rome simply folded the truth into the shadows and buried it under layers of official silence. The girls returned to their villas, but the people who came home were not the ones who left. They were shells, walking corpses, bodies that still breathed, but souls that had died on the Palatine Hill and were never permitted to return. In cruel Roman society, a noblewoman's worth lived and died with her chastity. And though these girls were victims, children crushed beneath a system they could not resist. The stain followed them like a curse. Family honor was ranked above truth, above compassion, above their lives. Most never married. Most never lived. They were hidden in side rooms, in distant wings of their estates, kept away like shameful relics, seen only by the servants who left food at their doors. Their trauma unfolded in agonizing, predictable patterns. A hand on their shoulder triggered panic. A sudden noise made them collapse in fear. Sleep brought nightmares so vivid they woke screaming night after night. Physical captivity had ended, but the prison in their minds had no guards to kill, no emperor to overthrow, no key that could unlock them. For them, freedom was not a victory. It was a sentence, a lifelong exile inside their own bodies. Rome looked away. Rome always looked away. It was easier to blame the women than to confront its own corruption. Easier to bury a crime than confront a civilization's rotting foundation. Because the truth of Caligula's reign was never about one man. It was about the system that built him, fed him, protected him, and allowed the Garden of Venus to exist in the first place. Later historians could argue over the exact details. Whether Suetonius embellished, whether rival dynasties magnified his cruelty. But the convergence of sources tells us one thing without question. A machine of abuse existed, a machine built to satisfy one man's darkest impulses. And Rome allowed it to operate in silence. This wasn't an isolated horror. It was a flaw in the empire's very architecture. Rome concentrated its legislative, judicial, military, and even divine power into the hands of a single man. No checks, no limits, no escape if the wrong man climbed the throne. Caligula proved how thin the line truly is between civilization and savagery, between order and chaos, between ruler and monster. And that line was drawn not on marble, but on the bodies of the nameless girls who perished in the Garden of Venus. Rome built wonders that survived millennia: arenas, aqueducts, law codes. But it failed at the simplest duty of any society, to protect its most vulnerable from the predators at the top. The story of these women is not just a historical tragedy. It is a warning that echoes across time. A nation may reach the summit of power, but if it sacrifices human dignity in the process, its legacy will be written not in glory, but in shame. History is often shaped by the victors, but shadows have a way of surviving. The erased names, the unsent letters, the tears dried into silk pillows. They remain in the margins Rome tried to burn away. And now they belong to us. We, centuries later, must decide whether to look at those shadows or repeat them. Because evil does not always announce itself with swords and fire. Sometimes evil wears a crown. Sometimes evil hides behind silence. And sometimes evil thrives simply because too many people choose not to be outraged. If this story unsettled you, let it. If it angered you, let it. And if it made you think about the cost of unchecked power, then the voices Rome tried to erase have finally been heard. Let them never be buried again.